The sky over the Pacific was a vast, brilliant blue, a canvas of terrifying emptiness. Aboard the U.S. Navy warships, the air was thick with a tension that was as much psychological as it was physical. The drone of a Japanese bomber, a distant, persistent insectoid hum, grew into a deafening roar. On the deck, crews scrambled to their battle stations. The sleek, deadly form of a VAL, dive bomber or a Betty torpedo plane emerged from the glare, beginning its death-defying run. This was the moment of truth for the fleet's primary defense, the anti-aircraft gun. The order to fire was a thunderclap. Their 5-inch, 38 caliber guns, the backbone of the fleet's long-range air defense, erupted first, their deep, concussive blasts shaking the very steel of the ship. High above, the sky began to speckle with black, dozens, then hundreds of dark puffs of flak, clustering around the approaching aircraft like angry bees. To a civilian observer, it looked devastating, a wall of fire and shrapnel meant to shred anything in its path. But to the gunners and commanders, it was a desperate, heartbreaking lottery. The problem was not a lack of courage or skill, it was a fundamental, mathematical flaw in the very concept of anti-aircraft warfare. Hitting a small, fast, and maneuvering target in three-dimensional space with an artillery shell was, statistically, almost an act of madness. The process was a complex ballet of guesswork and geometry. Spotters would estimate the target's altitude, speed, and bearing. This data was fed into a mechanical computer, an analog marvel of gears and cams called a range keeper, which would calculate a firing solution, a point in the sky where the shell and the aircraft were predicted to meet. The variables were endless and unforgiving. A pilot's slight change in course, a gust of wind, a minor error in estimating altitude, or even the variation in the burning rate of the powder in the shell casing, any one of these could throw the calculation into irrelevance. The shell, once fired, was a dumb piece of metal on a predetermined, unchangeable arc. It had to physically strike the aircraft or come so close that its fragmentation warhead could damage it. Their kill zone for a traditional flak burst was shockingly small, a plane had to be within perhaps 20 to 30 feet to be guaranteed destruction. More often, pilots would return to their carriers with flak holes in their wings and fuselages, shaken but alive. The aircraft, not the shell, held the advantage. The closer the enemy came, the more frantic the defense grew. As the bombers entered the inner envelope, the shorter-range weapons opened up. The 40mm Bofors guns hammered away with their distinctive pom-pom-pom sound, and the 20mm Ehrlichens chattered, filling the air with tracers that wove a fiery web around the ship. This spectacle was even more deceptive. The streams of glowing rounds seemed to be right on target, but they were, in fact, merely a visual prediction. The tracers showed where the shells had been, not where they were going. A pilot flying through this storm of steel was in mortal danger, but the odds were still in his favor. He was a living, thinking organism dodging a hail of unthinking projectiles. The result was a brutal, unsustainable arithmetic of defense. Naval commanders grimly calculated the cost per kill. It required, on average, over 2,500 rounds of 5-inch ammunition to shoot down a single enemy aircraft. In the heat of an intense air attack, like those faced in the Solomon Islands or the defensive task forces against determined Japanese air assaults, ships would expend virtually their entire ammunition load, only to watch helplessly as determined pilots broke through the barrage to deliver their deadly payloads. A single bomb or torpedo could cripple a cruiser, or send a carrier to the bottom. The bravery of the sailors was being nullified by the limitations of their technology. They were fighting a 20th-century threat with 19th-century ballistics. This problem was not unique to the Pacific. Over the skies of Britain and Germany, the same deadly calculus was playing out. British anti-aircraft gunners defending London against the V-1 buzz bombs found themselves in a similar predicament. These early cruise missiles flew at high speed on a steady course, a theoretically easier target than a piloted plane. Yet, even against these, the success rate was dismal. Thousands of shells were fired for every V-1 destroyed. The ground shook from the bombardment, and the sky was black with flak, but the flying bombs kept coming, their pulsating engines cutting out only to be followed by the devastating explosion on the city below. The core of the problem was the fuse. For centuries, artillery had relied on one of two methods: impact or time. An impact fuse detonated on contact. A time fuse was set before firing, calculated to burn for a specific duration and explode at a predetermined point in the air. The time fuse was the best tool available for anti-aircraft work, but it was hopelessly flawed. Setting it required a near-perfect prediction of the target's future position. An error of a fraction of a second meant a miss by hundreds of feet. The shell had no awareness of its target. It could not see. It could not adjust. It was deaf, dumb, and blind, exploding in a void, hoping against hope that its target would, by sheer chance, be in the same place at the same time. For the Allies, this was the impossible problem. They possessed the industrial might to produce ships, planes, and guns in overwhelming numbers. They had the brave men to crew them. But they lacked a crucial, war-winning piece of technology, a way to make a shell intelligent. A way to make it understand, at the very last second of its flight, that its target was right there. The solution would not come from making the guns bigger or the computers faster. It would require a leap into a new realm of science, merging the nascent power of radar with the destructive force of artillery. It would require a shell that could think for itself. The quest to solve this impossible problem would become one of the most secret and most consequential projects of the Second World War. The failure of traditional anti-aircraft defense created a vacuum of desperation, and it was in this void that one of the most revolutionary concepts of the war was born. The idea was as simple in its objective as it was monumental in its engineering challenge: create an artillery shell that could sense its own proximity to a target and detonate at the perfect moment to achieve a kill. It would not be a dumb projectile, but a thinking weapon. It would not require a perfect prediction, only a near miss. This was the radical premise of the proximity fuse, and its genesis was not in a military staff room, but in the quiet, academic corridors of American science, spurred into frantic action by the gathering storm in Europe. The spark came from the National Defense Research Committee, NDRC, established by President Roosevelt in 1940 and led by the brilliant electrical engineer Vannevar Bush. Bush understood that the next great advances in warfare would come not from incremental improvements to existing weapons, but from the direct application of cutting-edge science. One of the NDRC's first priorities was to address the crippling ineffectiveness of anti-aircraft artillery. The British, who had been fighting for their survival during the Battle of Britain, had already begun exploring the concept of a radio proximity fuse. They had made some progress, but their efforts were hampered by the immediate pressures of defending their homeland and the limitations of their electronic components, which were not robust enough to survive the violent launch from a gun. The baton was passed to the United States, where the vast resources of American industry and academia could be brought to bear. The task was assigned to Section T, the T standing for its director, Merle Tuve of the Carnegie Institution. Tuve, a physicist of immense energy and organizational skill, assembled a team of the nation's best physicists, engineers, and radio specialists. Their mandate was to achieve the impossible: miniaturize a working radio transceiver, complete with a power source and explosives, small enough to fit inside the nose of a 5-inch artillery shell, and rugged enough to withstand the 20,000 gs of force experienced when fired from a naval gun. The fundamental principle was radar. The team knew that a tiny, battery-powered radio set inside the shell could act as a miniature radar unit. It would continuously transmit a radio signal. As the shell arced toward its target, the radio waves would reflect off the enemy aircraft and return to the fuse. A sensitive receiver inside the fuse would detect this returning signal. The key insight was the Doppler effect. As the shell approached the aircraft at a combined closing speed of hundreds of meters per second, the frequency of the returned signal would shift. The electronics could be designed to recognize this specific shift. When the signal strength and the Doppler shift indicated the target was at the optimal lethal distance, not on impact, but perhaps 70 feet away, the fuse would trigger the shell's high-explosive warhead. The challenges were Herculean. The first and most daunting was the force of acceleration. A commercial radio vacuum tube of the era would be instantly reduced to dust by the shock of firing. The team at Section T had to invent entirely new components from scratch. They developed rugged, subminiature vacuum tubes that were no larger than a human thumb and could be soldered directly into a circuit that was potted in a shock-absorbing plastic resin. They were tested in brutal conditions, mounted on sleds and slammed into barriers, fired from specially designed shock cannons, and subjected to intense centrifugal forces to simulate the spin stabilization of a shell in flight. The second challenge was power. The fuse needed to be entirely self-contained. It could not be activated by the gunner, it had to wake up on its own after being fired. The solution was as elegant as it was simple, a battery filled with a viscous electrolyte gel. In storage, the gel kept the chemical components separate, and the battery was inert. The tremendous force of the gun's firing would instantly crush a glass ampule inside the battery, mixing the electrolyte and activating the power source. By the time the shell was spinning through the air toward its target, its tiny electronic brain was humming with life, its radar pulses searching the void. The third challenge was the sheer miniaturization. Every component, the transmitter, the receiver, the amplifier, the thyrotron switch that would detonate the warhead, had to be crammed into the shell's ogive, the conical space at the nose, which also had to house the conventional explosives of the payload. The engineers worked with watchmaker precision, designing circuits that were marvels of efficiency and compactness. They were creating what was, for its time, the most sophisticated electronic device ever mass-produced, and they were doing so to be placed inside an artillery shell and fired at the enemy by the tens of thousands. By mid-1942, after 2 years of frenzied, secret work in laboratories and testing grounds, Section T had a working prototype. It was a triumph of American applied science, a blend of theoretical physics, electrical engineering, and brute force mechanical problem solving. They had taken an idea that bordered on science fiction, a shell that could see, and turned it into a tangible, functional device. But the birth of the idea was only the beginning. Now, it had to be tested in the crucible of war, and its keepers had to protect its secret with a vigilance greater than that afforded to the atomic bomb. For if the enemy discovered this technology and replicated it, the entire advantage would be lost, and the air defense problem would be handed right back to them. The thinking shell was ready. The world was not. The successful prototype was a proof of concept, a laboratory miracle that demonstrated the physical possibility of a proximity fuse. But the journey from a handful of working models to mass-producing hundreds of thousands of these electronic marvels was a war in itself, a battle against physics, manufacturing limitations, and the relentless pressure of time. Section T had conceived the idea, now, American industry had to give it life on an unimaginable scale. The engineering of the miniature radar was not merely a technical challenge, it was an orchestration of the nation's entire scientific and industrial genius, pushing the boundaries of electronics, materials science, and precision manufacturing to their absolute limits. The heart of the fuse was its vacuum tube. The standard commercial tubes of the era were fragile glass bulbs, prone to microphonics and shattering under the slightest stress. They were utterly useless for an application requiring them to survive a 20,000 gunshot acceleration. The solution emerged from a collaboration between Section T and the Raytheon Corporation, spearheaded by a brilliant engineer named Percy Spencer. The task was to reimagine the vacuum tube from first principles. The result was the VT-158, later nicknamed the doorknob tube for its unique, ruggedized design. It was a masterpiece of miniaturization and durability. Instead of delicate, hair-thin filaments and widely spaced elements, the VT-158 used a stout, rugged filament and compressed its internal elements into a tiny, solid block. The glass envelope was made exceptionally thick and was often coated in a dark phenolic resin to shield it from light and further reinforce its structure. These tubes were so robust they could be hammered into a wooden plank and still function. They were the sturdy, beating hearts of the thinking shell. But a heart is useless without a nervous system. The circuitry that connected these tubes had to be equally resilient. Traditional hand-soldered wiring and breadboard-style construction would be pulverized by the gun's firing. The engineers developed a revolutionary solution, the printed circuit. While the concept existed in a primitive form, the proximity fuse program demanded its first large-scale, practical application. Circuits were printed onto a thin bakelite card, and the components, the tiny doorknob tubes, resistors, and capacitors, were then soldered directly onto these printed paths. This entire assembly was then suspended within the fuse's cylindrical body and potted in a shock-absorbing wax or plastic resin. This process, known as potting, was critical. It encased the delicate electronics in a solid block, distributing the immense forces of acceleration evenly across the entire assembly, preventing any single component from bearing the full shock. The result was a solid, monolithic block of electronics, a brain that could be fired from a cannon. The power source presented another monumental challenge. A conventional battery would be destroyed or would leak. The solution was as ingenious as it was simple: the reserve battery. In its inert state, the battery was dry and inactive. The force of firing acted as the trigger. Inside the battery casing was a glass ampule filled with a liquid electrolyte, surrounded by the dry chemical components of the cell. The acceleration of the launch would drive a plunger forward, shattering the ampule and releasing the electrolyte, which would instantly soak the chemical core, activating the battery. The timing was precise. Within a fraction of a second of leaving the gun barrel, the shell's electronics were powered up, its miniature radar beginning to transmit its silent, searching pulses. This was a power source that was born from the violence of its own launch. The final piece of the puzzle was the fuse body itself. It had to be a perfect marriage of electronics and high explosives. The entire assembly needed to screw into the standard fuse well of a 5-inch shell, maintaining the ballistic profile and, most importantly, arming itself only after a safe distance from the firing ship. The design incorporated a set of safety devices. A turbine, spun by the airflow as the shell traveled, would only complete the final arming circuit after the shell had traveled a certain distance, ensuring it could not detonate prematurely near friendly forces. It was a weapon of immense power that was also, by necessity, engineered to be exceptionally safe to handle and fire. The manufacturing process became a secret empire in itself. Their work was distributed across the country to maintain security and leverage specialized expertise. Crosley Corporation, a radio manufacturer, took the lead in mass production. They set up assembly lines that were more akin to a delicate laboratory than a traditional factory. Their work was done in clean rooms by operators, many of them women, who handled the tiny components with the precision of surgeons. The final assembly and the pouring of the explosive potting compound were done with extreme care. Each completed fuse was then subjected to a rigorous testing regimen, being spun in centrifuges and vibrated on shaking tables to simulate the stresses of flight. By 1943, this colossal engineering effort was yielding results. Their funny fuse, as it was sometimes cryptically called, was moving from the realm of a laboratory experiment to a deployable weapon. The miniature radar was no longer a theoretical concept, it was a physical object, rolling off production lines by the thousands. It represented a new era of warfare, where the advantage would no longer belong solely to the side with the biggest guns or the bravest soldiers, but to the side with the smallest, smartest, and most resilient electronics. The shell that could think was ready for its debut. All it needed was a target, and a command structure willing to risk its most guarded secret to change the course of the war. The theoretical models were promising. The laboratory tests were successful. The production lines were humming. But the true test of the proximity fuse lay not in the controlled environments of American factories, but in the unforgiving crucible of combat. The Pacific Theater, with its vast oceanic expanses and the fanatical determination of Japanese air attacks, was chosen as the proving ground. Here, their funny fuse would face its ultimate trial under conditions of extreme humidity, corrosive salt air, and the relentless pressure of aerial assault. The decision to deploy it there was a calculated risk of the highest order, pitting America's most secret technological marvel against an enemy known for his willingness to fly his plane directly into the side of a ship. Their first deployments in late 1942 and early 1943 were shrouded in a blanket of secrecy so dense it extended to the very sailors who used the weapon. The fuses were shipped to the fleet under heavy guard, stored in vaults, and their handling was governed by a strict protocol. Only a handful of senior officers on each ship knew their true nature and capability. To the gunners, they were simply a new type of ammunition, designated special or VT, variable time, a deliberately vague term. They were instructed that these shells were not to be used over land, and under no circumstances were dud rounds to be allowed to fall into enemy hands. If a ship was in danger of being captured, the remaining VT shells were to be jettisoned into the ocean or destroyed. The secret was considered more valuable than the ship itself. The initial combat use was tentative, almost anticlimactic. Fitted into the 5-inch anti-aircraft shells of cruisers and destroyers, the first VT-fused rounds were fired at the ubiquitous Japanese Snoopers, long-range reconnaissance planes that shadowed the fleet. The results were immediate and shocking. Where once it would have taken hundreds, if not thousands, of rounds to score a kill on a distant, maneuvering plane, now it often took only a few salvos. A crew would fire, and instead of the familiar black puffs of flak scattered hopefully around the target, they would see a single, perfect burst, a white flash and a cloud of shrapnel that seemed to materialize right next to the aircraft. The plane would stagger, sometimes disintegrating, sometimes trailing smoke as it spiraled into the sea. The gunners were amazed, but often attributed it to a lucky shot. They did not yet know they were firing a weapon that made luck a matter of physics. As the months progressed and the VT fuse was integrated more fully into the fleet's air defense strategy, its impact became undeniable. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, later dubbed the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, provided the first large-scale demonstration. As wave after wave of Japanese aircraft attacked the U.S. fleet, the sky was filled with the devastatingly efficient work of the proximity fuse. American pilots, flying combat air patrol above, reported seeing Japanese planes exploding mysteriously in mid-air, caught in flak bursts of uncanny accuracy. The kill ratios were staggering. One destroyer, the USS Charles Osborne, was credited with shooting down several aircraft with just a dozen rounds, an efficiency rate that was previously unimaginable. The Japanese naval air arm was being systematically annihilated, and a key reason was a weapon they did not know existed. The ultimate test came with the advent of the kamikaze in late 1944. This new tactic presented a problem for which traditional gunnery was almost useless. A pilot intent on suicide was not a target that could be scared away or forced to break off his attack. He was a guided missile of flesh and blood, and he only needed to be lucky once. A near miss with a time-fused shell was meaningless, the plane would fly straight through the shrapnel cloud, damaged but still lethal. The proximity fuse changed the equation entirely. Now, a shell did not need to score a direct hit. It only needed to come close. As a kamikaze dove towards its target, a well-aimed salvo of VT-fused shells would detonate all around it, creating a lethal sphere of shrapnel that would shred the aircraft's wings, destroy its engine, or kill the pilot before he could complete his final dive. It was the only weapon that could reliably stop a determined suicide attack at a safe distance from the ship. The psychological impact on the crews was profound. For sailors who had lived in terror of the divine wind, the proximity fuse became a guardian angel. The constant, grinding anxiety of watching a speck in the sky grow into a deadly, unstoppable threat was alleviated. They now had a weapon that could actually defend them. Morale soared. The confidence instilled by this technological edge was a tangible force multiplier. Gunners developed new tactics, firing box barrages that filled the airspace around the fleet with invisible, lethal spheres of influence that no enemy plane could penetrate without triggering its own destruction. The brutal testing ground of the Pacific had proven the fuse's worth beyond anyone's most optimistic hopes. It had saved ships, it had saved lives, and it had fundamentally altered the balance of naval power in the Pacific. But its use had been carefully contained, a secret guarded with paranoid intensity. The Japanese, though devastated by its effects, never fully understood the nature of the weapon that was decimating their air forces. They attributed the incredible accuracy to improved American radar or better-trained gunners. The success in the Pacific paved the way for an even more audacious deployment, one that would break the cardinal rule of its use and unleash this secret naval weapon over land, against a completely different kind of threat, in the skies of London. In the vast and secretive landscape of the American war effort, the Manhattan Project has long been remembered as the pinnacle of clandestine science, a venture so shrouded in mystery that even its vice president was kept in the dark. Yet, within the innermost circles of military and scientific leadership, there existed another secret considered, in some ways, even more delicate and more immediately perilous if lost, the proximity fuse. While the atomic bomb was a theoretical city-killer, a weapon of ultimate last resort, the proximity fuse was a tactical game-changer being deployed in active combat every day. Its secret was not just in its design, but in its very existence. If the enemy were to capture a single, intact dud round, the entire technological advantage could be reversed, potentially within months. This fear governed every aspect of its life cycle, from factory to front line, with a paranoia that surpassed even the protocols for the bomb. The security apparatus surrounding the fuse, codenamed initially simply the fuse, or VT, for variable time, was a masterpiece of compartmentalization and disinformation. The first and most ironclad rule was its restricted use. President Roosevelt himself had approved its deployment with one critical caveat: it was never to be used over land where a dud could be recovered by enemy troops. This confined its use primarily to the vast expanses of the Pacific Ocean, where any malfunctioning round would be lost to the depths. This rule was sacrosanct. To break it would require a direct order from the highest level of command, a risk so grave it was considered only when the survival of the nation itself seemed to hang in the balance. The manufacturing process was fractured and anonymized to prevent any single person or facility from understanding the complete picture. The rugged vacuum tubes were produced at a Raytheon plant, their true purpose hidden behind other military contracts. The intricate printed circuits were assembled by workers at Crosley Corporation who knew only that they were building a sensitive electronic component. The final assembly, where the electronics were married to the explosive train and potted in resin, was conducted under intense security. Workers were vetted, sworn to secrecy, and worked on isolated parts of the process. None knew the full function of the device they were creating. It was simply a fuse, and curiosity was actively discouraged as a threat to national security. This compartmentalization extended to the fleet. On the ships that carried the VT shells, they were stored in locked magazines, accessible only to the gunnery officer and a trusted few. The fuses were shipped with their own armed Marine guards, whose orders were clear: protect the secret at all costs. Sailors loading the 5-inch guns were not told why some rounds were marked special. They were simply following orders. If a gun crew witnessed the almost magical effect of the fuse, a single shell burst destroying a distant aircraft, they might marvel at their own luck or improved training. The official line, when questions arose, is that it was a new, highly sensitive radio fuse, an explanation that was both true and deliberately vague enough to reveal nothing of its revolutionary radar guidance principle. The contrast with the Manhattan Project was stark. The atomic bomb was being built at massive, remote facilities like Oak Ridge and Hanford, its scale making absolute secrecy a monumental challenge. Its purpose, while hidden, was ultimately the creation of a single, cataclysmic event. The proximity fuse, however, was a consumable weapon. It was being produced by the hundreds of thousands and fired away, one by one, into the sky. Every single launch was a potential security breach. A dud that failed to detonate its high explosive charge could still contain its perfectly intact electronic brain, landing in enemy territory as a perfectly packaged gift of top-secret technology. This constant, daily risk required a different kind of vigilance, a pervasive, ongoing operational secrecy that had to be maintained across thousands of ships and tens of thousands of men. The fear was not unfounded. German and Japanese scientists were perfectly capable of reverse engineering the device if given a sample. They had their own advanced radar and electronics programs. A captured fuse would reveal not just a new weapon, but an entire new philosophy of warfare: the miniaturization of radar and the integration of electronics into artillery. The Allies knew that the Germans were working on their own proximity fuses, using acoustic sensors, but these were bulky, less reliable, and nowhere near as advanced as the American radio fuse. If the enemy captured a VT fuse, they would leapfrog years of research and development, potentially turning the flak-filled skies over Berlin into a death trap for Allied bombers, or creating their own smart artillery shells to devastage Allied ground forces. This is why the secret of the fuse was, in the words of one high-ranking official, the most valuable in the entire war effort, next to the atom bomb itself, and in some respects more so. The atom bomb was a looming, existential threat. The proximity fuse was a present, tactical reality that was saving countless lives and winning battles daily. Its compromise would have an immediate and catastrophic impact on the course of the war. It was a secret that was not locked in a desert laboratory, but was being hurled at the enemy by the thousands, a secret that lived and died with every pull of a lanyard on a naval gun. The immense success of this security blanket, the fact that not a single intact fuse was ever recovered by Axis forces, stands as one of the greatest intelligence victories of World War II, a silent, unsung triumph that allowed the shell that thinks to remain the Allies' most devastating and unexpected surprise. By late 1944, the war in the Pacific had taken a terrifying and psychologically shattering turn. The Imperial Japanese Navy, bled white by catastrophic losses in the Philippine Sea and Leyte Gulf, was a shattered force. Its carrier aviation, once the most skilled in the world, had been virtually annihilated. In its place arose a new, desperate tactic that sought to weaponize despair itself, the kamikaze. This was not merely a new form of attack, it was a fundamental rejection of the conventional calculus of war, replacing strategy with a terrifying form of spiritual annihilation. For the American fleet, it created a defensive crisis for which they were tragically unprepared, a crisis that would force them to make a desperate decision that broke their most sacred rule. The first organized kamikaze attack struck during the Battle of Leyte Gulf. To the sailors manning the rails of the U.S. fleet, the sight was incomprehensible. A Japanese aircraft, often damaged or obsolete, would not break off its attack run when faced with a wall of flak. Instead, it would steady its course, plunging through the storm of steel with a single, horrifying purpose: to merge with its target. These were not dumb bombs, they were guided missiles with a human brain, capable of last-second corrections, flying low to avoid radar, and aiming for the most vulnerable parts of a ship, the flight deck of a carrier, the bridge of a destroyer. Traditional anti-aircraft doctrine collapsed in the face of this threat. The mathematics of rounds per kill became meaningless. A time-fused shell that exploded 20 yards from a conventional bomber might force it to veer away. The same burst was a mere inconvenience to a kamikaze pilot who welcomed death. A direct hit was often the only guarantee of a stop, and achieving that against a small, fast, diving target was a matter of pure chance. The 40mm and 20mm batteries, deadly at close range, often only managed to shred the aircraft in the final seconds of its dive, turning it into a lethal cloud of shrapnel and burning fuel that still slammed into the ship. The destroyer USS Laffey earned the nickname, the ship that would not die, after surviving an onslaught of 22 kamikazes and conventional bombers, but her ordeal was a testament to sheer durability and crew bravery, not to effective defense. She was a punching bag that refused to fall. The toll was devastating, not just in ships sunk and damaged, but in crew morale. A deep, pervasive anxiety settled over the fleet. The sky was no longer just a battlefield, it was a source of existential dread. Every speck on the horizon, every radar contact, could be a one-way ticket to oblivion. Watchstanders stared until their eyes ached, knowing that a single failure of concentration could mean the death of hundreds of their shipmates. The psychological warfare was as effective as the physical destruction. The United States Navy, the most powerful naval force in history, was being bled by a tactic born of sheer fanaticism. In this cauldron of fear and fire, one weapon had consistently proven its worth: the proximity fuse. In the naval anti-aircraft role, it was the only system that could reliably kill a kamikaze at a safe distance. A salvo of VT-fused 5-inch shells would detonate around the incoming plane, creating a lethal kill box that could shred its control surfaces, destroy its engine, or kill the pilot before he could line up his final dive. It was not infallible, but it was the closest thing to a shield the fleet had. Yet, its use was strictly governed by the presidential mandate forbidding its use over land. As the campaign pushed closer to Japan, particularly during the brutal invasion of Okinawa, the distinction between over land and over water became dangerously blurred. The fleet was operating inches from the enemy-held shore, and kamikazes were coming from all directions, often approaching overland masses to mask their radar signature. The dilemma for the high command was agonizing. To continue restricting the VT fuse was to accept catastrophic and unsustainable losses to the fleet, losses that threatened to derail the final assault on the Japanese home islands. To authorize its use over land, even the small, densely packed island of Okinawa, was to risk the secret. A dud round, fired at a plane over the island, could fall into Japanese hands. The enemy, cornered and desperate, would spare no effort to recover and analyze this wonder weapon that was decimating their last hope. The decision was made at the highest levels of the Navy command. The risk to the fleet was deemed greater than the risk of the secret being compromised. The order was given, the proximity fuse was authorized for use in the defense of the fleet off Okinawa, even if it meant firing over enemy-held territory. It was a momentous gamble. They were betting that the sheer chaos of the battle, the speed of their advance, and the destructive power of the fuse itself would prevent a working model from being recovered. The result was the Great Okinawa Turkey Shoot. As hundreds of kamikazes descended on the fleet in coordinated waves called kikusu, floating chrysanthemum, attacks, the skies were filled with the devastatingly efficient bursts of VT-fused shells. The kill rates soared. While the battle still represented the Navy's highest losses from a single campaign, military analysts later concluded that without the proximity fuse, the losses would have been 3 to 4 times worse. The weapon had saved the fleet from annihilation. The desperate decision had been the right one. Through a combination of overwhelming firepower and fortune, the secret held. No dud was recovered. The thinking shell had faced its most dire test and had proven itself not just a technological marvel, but a vital, war-winning weapon that had staved off a tactical and psychological crisis of unimaginable proportions. The threat that materialized over London in the summer of 1944 was of a different nature than the screaming Stuka dive bombers of the Blitz. It was impersonal, mechanical, and psychologically unnerving in its relentless monotony. The V-1 flying bomb, dubbed Doodlebug or Buzz Bomb by Londoners, was the first of Hitler's promised vengeance weapons. It was a small, pilotless aircraft with a pulsating jet engine that produced a distinctive, terrifying put-put-put sound. When that sound suddenly cut out, it was followed by an eerie, deathly silence as the bomb tipped over into its dive, then the cataclysmic explosion that can level an entire city block. It was a weapon designed not for military precision, but for terror, launched in their hundreds from fixed sites across the Channel to burn the heart out of British morale. The initial British defense against this onslaught was a multi-layered, yet frustratingly inefficient, system. Fast fighter aircraft like the new Tempest and Meteor were scrambled to intercept the V-1s over the Channel. It was dangerous work. A pilot had to fly alongside the bomb, his wingtip mere feet from its explosive-filled fuselage, and either shoot it down or, even more daringly, tip it over with his wing, sending it spiraling into the water. Anti-aircraft guns were positioned along the south coast, and a vast belt of barrage balloons surrounded London. But the guns, using traditional time-fused shells, were woefully inadequate. The V-1s were small, fast, and flew low, making them difficult targets for radar-directed fire. The success rate was dismally low. Thousands of shells were expended for every V-1 destroyed. London was being pounded into rubble by a robot, and the best defenses could only slightly thin the incoming hordes. It was in this desperate context that a radical and highly controversial proposal was put forward: deploy the American proximity fuse. This presented a monumental command decision fraught with risk. Using the VT fuse over the English Channel and the British countryside violated the cardinal rule of its deployment. A dud round falling on English soil could, in theory, be recovered by a German agent. The secret of the fuse, guarded so fiercely for 2 years, would be jeopardized for a weapon that, while terrifying, was not decisively impacting the course of the war. The arguments were heated. Some saw it as an unacceptable risk. Others, seeing the nightly destruction in London, argued that the moral and political necessity to protect the civilian population outweighed the potential intelligence loss. Winston Churchill, with the support of Allied High Command, made the fateful choice. In July 1944, a massive reorganization of the V-1 defenses was implemented, known as their anti-diver plan. The heavy anti-aircraft batteries, equipped with the latest radar and fire control systems, were moved to the coast. And crucially, they were supplied with a new type of ammunition, American 5-inch shells fitted with the top-secret proximity fuse. The effect was nothing short of revolutionary. The V-1, for all its terror, was an ideal target for the VT fuse. It flew a straight, level course at a consistent speed and altitude. It did not take evasive action. For the smart shell, it was a predictable, perfect customer. The gunnery equation was simplified from an art into a science. A battery would lock its radar onto an incoming buzz bomb, the fire control computer would calculate the lead, and a salvo of VT-fused shells would be sent skyward. They no longer had to hit the small, fast-flying bomb. They only had to come close. From the ground, the change was dramatic. Where once the sky had been filled with the scattered, ineffective black puffs of time-fused flak, now observers saw single, precise white flashes erupting next to the V1s. A direct hit was unnecessary. The fuse would detect the flying bomb's metal skin and detonate at the optimal standoff distance, the cloud of shrapnel shredding the V1's paper-thin airframe, detonating its fuel or severing its control wires. The distinctive engine would sputter and die, and the bomb would plunge harmlessly into the open fields or waters below. The kill rate of the coastal guns skyrocketed. In the week before the deployment of the VT fuse, anti-aircraft guns had been shooting down about 17% of incoming V1s. In the week after, that figure leaped to over 70%. By August, it was approaching 90%. The month of August 1944 became known to the gun crews as their Doodlebug massacre. It was a systematic, mechanical slaughter. The batteries worked around the clock, the barrels of their guns glowing hot from constant firing. The skies over the Kent and Sussex coasts became a graveyard for Hitler's vengeance weapon. The psychological impact on Londoners was immense. The constant, grinding tension of the buzz bombs began to ease. The relentless bombardment slowed to a trickle. Hope, which had been stretched to its breaking point, was restored. The deployment of the proximity fuse against the V1 was a strategic masterstroke that achieved three critical objectives. First, it saved London from potentially being rendered uninhabitable, preserving British morale and the political stability of a key ally. Second, it proved the fuse's versatility beyond naval warfare, demonstrating its game-changing potential against any predictable aerial target. But third, and perhaps most importantly, it validated the desperate gamble of breaking its own security protocol. Not a single VT fuse was recovered by the enemy. The secret remained intact, allowing this wonder weapon to be prepared for its final, and most devastating, role, not in the air, but on the ground, as a new form of artillery that would rain hell upon the German army itself. The success of the proximity fuse against aircraft and flying bombs was a tactical marvel, but its ultimate revolution would occur not in the sky, but in the mud and blood of the infantryman's world. For centuries, the curse of the soldier on the battlefield had been enemy artillery. The standard high-explosive shell was a terror weapon, but its effectiveness was limited by a fundamental geometric problem: it exploded on impact, sending its destructive force primarily outward and upward. A soldier lying in a foxhole, or even a shallow depression, stood a reasonable chance of survival unless the shell landed directly in his hole. The only thing more terrifying was a direct hit from a shell that detonated a few feet above the ground, an airburst. This was the holy grail of artillerymen, a round that could scour a foxhole clean, that could send shrapnel slicing down in a perfect, lethal cone, that could kill everything in the open within a much larger radius. Before the VT fuse, achieving this was a matter of luck or complex, unreliable mechanical timers. The proximity fuse changed everything. It turned every artillery piece into a weapon that could, on command, produce a perfect airburst over the heads of its enemies. The first major test of this new doctrine came during the Battle of the Bulge. In the frozen, fog-shrouded forests of the Ardennes, American infantry divisions were fighting for their lives against the surprise German offensive. The weather had grounded Allied air power, and the rugged, wooded terrain neutralized many of the advantages of American armor. The GIs, outnumbered and surrounded in places like Bastogne, were relying on their artillery to hold the line. It was here that the VT fuse was secretly and systematically introduced into field artillery for the first time. The order to use it over land, even against the Germans, was another monumental risk, but the desperation of the situation demanded it. The secret was now being risked not just on a remote Pacific island, but in the heart of Europe, where dud rounds could easily be recovered by the technologically sophisticated Germans. The effect on the German infantry was apocalyptic. They were masters of defensive warfare, experts at digging in and using the terrain for protection. Their standard tactic when under artillery fire was to immediately throw themselves into their foxholes or ditches, knowing that the standard impact fused shells would have to land almost directly on top of them to be lethal. But now, something incomprehensible was happening. American artillery barrages began to kill them in their foxholes. There was no warning whistle culminating in a ground-shaking crater. Instead, the shells seemed to detonate in the air, just above the treetops, with a sharp, shattering crack. A storm of red-hot steel shrapnel then rained down vertically, perfectly designed to find anyone seeking shelter below. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical destruction. The German soldiers' most fundamental survival instinct, to get low, had been rendered null and void. There was no shelter. A private in the 1st Infantry Division, witnessing the aftermath of a VT-fused barrage on a German position, described it as seeing a field that had been plowed by an invisible farmer. The ground was churned, the trees were stripped of branches, and the enemy positions were littered with the bodies of men who had died without a crater in sight. The Germans had no idea what was happening. They attributed it to a new, incredibly sensitive impact fuse or some form of advanced timed fusing. The concept of a shell with its own miniature radar set was so advanced it was beyond their comprehension, even as they were being slaughtered by it. The tactical applications multiplied. In the dense Hurtgen forest, where shells often detonated harmlessly in the thick canopy of trees, VT-fused rounds were set to burst just above the treetops, sending a deadly rain of splinters and steel down onto the German positions below. They were used for final protective fire, where batteries would lay a curtain of airbursts directly in front of American lines to shred any attacking infantry. They were used for counter-battery fire, where the airbursts were far more effective at disabling exposed artillery crews and their equipment than ground bursts. The revolution was in the shift from area saturation to precision extermination. A battery of 6 howitzers firing VT-fused shells could now achieve the casualty-producing effect that previously required an entire battalion of 24 guns firing conventional rounds. It was a force multiplier of staggering proportions. American artillery, already the most sophisticated in the world due to its flexible communication and fire direction control, had now been given a weapon that made it exponentially more lethal. A German officer captured during the Bulge confessed in an interrogation, "Your artillery is not like ours. It follows us everywhere. There is no escape." He was speaking of the volume of fire, but the unspoken subtext was its new, unnerving quality. The VT fuse had broken the ancient contract of the battlefield. The earth itself, the soldier's oldest ally, could no longer be trusted to provide safety. The sky had become the source of death, and every American artillery shell was now a thinking, seeing entity that hunted men from above. The artillery revolution was complete, and it had turned the battlefield into a place with no cover and no quarter. The Ardennes offensive, Hitler's last, desperate gamble in the West, was predicated on speed, surprise, and shock. Its spearheads, composed of the finest panzer divisions left to the Wehrmacht, were meant to slice through the thin American lines, cross the Meuse River, and race for the port of Antwerp, splitting the Allied armies in two. The plan relied on bad weather, a thick, perpetual overcast that would ground the dreaded Allied J-bows, fighter bombers. For the first week, it worked. German tanks and infantry, including elite SS units, poured through the gaps, surrounding entire regiments and pushing the American front into a deep, dangerous bulge. But the offensive contained the seeds of its own destruction. It was launching itself into the teeth of the one Allied arm that the weather could not neutralize, American artillery. And unbeknownst to the Germans, that artillery had just been gifted with a new, razor-sharp fang. The Battle of the Bulge would become the brutal, definitive proving ground for the proximity fuse in land warfare, and the event that would shatter the fighting power of Germany's best divisions. The initial chaos of the German breakthrough masked the systematic application of the new weapon. As American units fell back in disarray, often fighting desperate delaying actions from isolated villages and roadblocks, their artillery batteries were setting up new firing positions. The order had come down, the VT fuse was authorized for use. The shells, still handled with extreme secrecy, began to flow to the front. The first major test came against massed infantry attacks. The German tactic, perfected on the Eastern Front, was to assault with waves of Volksgrenadiers, often at night or in fog. Against conventional artillery, these human wave attacks could be effective, as the shells would bury themselves in the frozen earth, their fragmentation pattern largely wasted. Now, when the American artillery fired in defense, the results were horrifyingly different. At the Siege of Bastogne, the 101st Airborne and other encircled units called for fire on German formations massing in the woods for an attack. The responding salvos of VT-fused shells airburst over the tree canopy. There were few large craters. Instead, the forest was filled with the sharp, cracking reports of shells detonating in the air, followed by the sound of shrapnel and tree branches raining down. The attacking German infantry, caught in the open, were scythed down. A soldier from the 5th Fallschirmjäger Division described the experience as unnatürlich, unnatural. There was no crater to hide in, he said. The fire came from above. We lost whole platoons in minutes. The men began to call it their devil's rain. The psychological effect was profound. The assault would disintegrate before it even reached American lines. The fuse proved equally devastating against one of the Germans' most feared tactical assets, their expert artillery observers. These forward observers, often hidden in church steeples or on high ground, were the eyes of the German artillery, directing deadly accurate fire onto American positions. Counterbattery fire with impact shells was a game of guesswork, requiring a direct hit on the observer's position. Now, American batteries could simply fire a VT-fused shell programmed to airburst over the suspected location. The shrapnel cone would cleanse the area, killing the observers and destroying their equipment without needing a direct hit. The German artillery, blinded, became significantly less effective. Perhaps the most decisive application was against armored formations. A direct hit from a standard artillery shell was unlikely to destroy a tank, unless it was a very lucky strike on a thin part of the armor. But tanks are not impervious islands, they are the center of a small ecosystem of support. They rely on accompanying infantry to protect them from close-in anti-tank teams. They rely on soft-skinned vehicles for fuel and ammunition. They rely on exposed crew members who sometimes rode on the outside of their hull. A barrage of VT-fused shells airbursting over a column of tanks and half-tracks was catastrophic. The shrapnel would kill the accompanying panzergrenadiers, shred the fuel trucks, and, critically, force every tank commander to button up inside his hatch, severely limiting his visibility and situational awareness. A buttoned-up tank is a blind and vulnerable tank. Slowed, isolated from its infantry, and blind, the armored spearhead became a sitting duck for American tank destroyers and bazooka teams waiting in ambush. The cumulative effect of this unseen weapon throughout the weeks of the Bulge was the systematic dismemberment of the German war machine at a tactical level. Divisions that had begun the offensive at near full strength were, by early January, hollowed-out skeletons. Their infantry companies were decimated by their air explosions. Their artillery was muted. Their armored thrusts were blunted. They were not just being pushed back, they were being annihilated in place. The German high command was baffled. They knew American artillery was powerful, but the reports from the front described a new level of lethality that defied explanation. They suspected new types of munitions, flechette rounds or improved shrapnel, but the secret of the radio proximity fuse remained safe. Not a single report from the Ardennes correctly identified its nature. The victory in the Bulge was a triumph of American infantry courage, of junior leadership, and of logistical resilience. But underpinning it all was the awesome, terrifying power of an artillery force that had just undergone a qualitative revolution. The proximity fuse had turned the artillery barrage from a suppressive tool into a precise killing machine. It broke the back of Germany's last major offensive in the West, inflicting casualties from which the Wehrmacht could never recover. The road to the Rhine now lay open, and the weapon that had helped clear it remained a secret, ready to lead the final, crushing advance into the heart of the Reich. The Bulge had been the test, and the fuse had passed with brutal, overwhelming marks. Beyond it lay only the end. In the grand, public narrative of World War II, certain icons dominate the collective memory: the atomic mushroom cloud over Hiroshima, the storming of the Normandy beaches, the fleets of bombers blackening the sky over Germany. These are the visible, cataclysmic symbols of Allied victory. Yet, operating in the shadows of these colossal events, was a weapon whose total impact on the conflict's duration and cost in blood may have been just as profound. The proximity fuse never garnered headlines. It was a secret too valuable to celebrate, a tactical advantage too devastating to reveal. But from the coral atolls of the Pacific to the frozen forests of the Ardennes, it was silently and systematically dismantling the enemy's ability to wage war, saving countless Allied lives, and arguably shortening their war by months. Quantifying the fuse's strategic value requires a look at the alternative realities it prevented. In the Pacific, without the VT fuse, the Kamikaze campaign would have been vastly more successful. Naval losses during the invasions of Iwo Jima and Okinawa, already severe, would have likely been 3 to 4 times greater. The crippling of the fleet off Okinawa could have delayed the final assault on the Japanese home islands by a year or more, necessitating a bloody and protracted island-hopping campaign even more brutal than the one already fought. The fuse, by preserving the fleet, kept the pressure on Japan at a relentless, unsustainable pace, making a direct invasion or a negotiated surrender the only two possible outcomes. In Europe, the fuse's contribution was equally decisive. The successful defense against the V-1 buzz bombs in the summer of 1944 prevented a collapse of civilian morale in London that could have had serious political repercussions for Churchill's government and the British war effort. But its most critical role was on the ground. During the Battle of the Bulge, the fuse was not merely a helpful tool, it was a battle-winning weapon. It stopped German infantry assaults cold. It blinded their artillery. It isolated and made vulnerable their armored spearheads. Without the catastrophic casualties inflicted by VT-fused artillery on the best remaining units of the Wehrmacht, the German offensive might have achieved deeper penetrations, taken key objectives like the Meuse River crossings, and prolonged the battle for weeks or months. The resulting delay to the Allied push into Germany would have given the Nazis more time to fortify the Siegfried Line and the Rhine, mobilizing more old men and boys for a final, fanatical stand. The fuse helped ensure the collapse in the West was rapid and total. The most compelling argument for the fuse as a war-shortening weapon lies in its effect on the fundamental arithmetic of combat. It dramatically increased the exchange ratio in favor of the Allies. In the air, it turned a 500 rounds per kill proposition into a matter of a few shells. On the ground, it made a single artillery battery as lethal as an entire battalion. This efficiency had a cascading effect. It preserved the lives of highly trained pilots, naval gunners, and infantrymen. It conserved vast quantities of steel, brass, and explosives, allowing the Allied war machine to strike harder, faster, and for longer. It broke the enemy's spirit in a way that conventional weapons could not, creating a pervasive, unexplained fear that corroded unit cohesion and the will to fight. A German soldier could steel himself against a known threat, but he could not defend against a shell that seemed to seek him out personally in his foxhole. When the war ended and the secret could finally be told, the architects of the project reflected on its success. James Van Allen, the physicist who would later discover the Earth's radiation belts, stated that the proximity fuse saved England, saved the Normandy invasion, and won the Battle of the Bulge. While perhaps an overstatement for dramatic effect, it captures the immense esteem in which the weapon was held by those who knew its full capabilities. It was a triumph of the Wizard War, that conflict of scientists and engineers waged in laboratories, whose outcomes often determined the fates of armies in the field. The legacy of the proximity fuse extends far beyond the Second World War. It pioneered the era of smart munitions. It demonstrated that the future of warfare lay not in building bigger explosions, but in building smarter ones. The principles of miniaturized electronics, ruggedized components, and integrated radar guidance directly paved the way for the guided missiles, smart bombs, and advanced air defense systems that define modern combat. It was the direct ancestor of the weapons that today can hit a specific window in a specific building from miles away. Yet, its greatest legacy remains its hidden service. It was the weapon that won a war without a name, the invention that saved lives without a tally. It did not end the war with a single, spectacular flash, but with thousands of small, precise bursts over foxholes, fighter planes, and flying bombs. It was the right weapon, at the right time, kept as the right secret. In the calculus of victory, where time is measured in lives lost, the proximity fuse bought the Allies precious months, and in doing so, saved a world from a future that would have been immeasurably darker and longer. It was the hidden weapon that shortened the war, and in the silence of its success, it echoes as one of the most consequential inventions of the 20th century.